For centuries, power seemed to obey a predictable formula: control territory. Raise armies, crown a ruler, and wealth would inevitably flow upward. Venice shattered that formula. It had no monarch issuing decrees from a throne, no fertile plains producing taxes and soldiers, no feudal lords guarding borders or castles anchoring authority. What Venice possessed instead was a lagoon: unstable water, shifting mud, and wooden stakes driven deep just to keep the city standing. By every medieval standard, it should have failed. Yet for generations, emperors, popes, crusading orders, and distant kings found themselves reliant on this improbable city. Not for cavalry, not for land, but for something far more powerful than weapons: financial trust. Venice did not dominate the world by conquest. It shaped it by organizing trade, credit, and confidence on a scale no one else understood. It transformed money from heavy metal into an invisible system, and in doing so rewired how power itself worked. This is not a story about ships and spices alone. It is a story about institutions, incentives, and belief. How a city without land became indispensable to empires with armies. How accounting replaced conquest. And how Venice built the foundations that endure. To understand how Venice transformed itself into a financial power, you first have to step outside the assumptions of medieval Europe. Most cities derived strength from land. Land produced crops, crops sustained people, people paid taxes, and filled armies. Power rose from the ground upward, moving through swords and banners before reaching thrones. Wealth followed conquest. Control the territory, and everything else followed naturally. Venice existed entirely outside that logic. The city emerged from a shallow lagoon, scattered across small islands barely capable of supporting permanent structures. Its foundations were not stone, but timber driven into mud. The surrounding waters were too unpredictable for farming and too narrow for traditional invasions. There were no estates to tax, no rural population to exploit, and no cavalry to deploy. The feudal system that organized nearly all of Europe simply could not function there. Venice had no choice but to invent an alternative. Instead of anchoring power in land, Venice anchored it in motion. Ships replaced fields, routes replaced borders, contracts replaced castles. The city survived by moving goods between worlds that could not or would not deal directly with each other. Spices from the East, silk from Asia, metals from Europe, and luxury goods from the Islamic world passed through Venetian hands. Venice became valuable not because it produced wealth, but because it connected wealth. This position gave Venice leverage long before it possessed formal independence. Officially, it acknowledged the authority of the Byzantine Empire. In practice, it operated with remarkable autonomy. As long as Venetian ships kept commerce flowing, Byzantium tolerated its independence. That arrangement hardened into something far more significant in 1082, when Emperor Alexios I granted Venice sweeping trade privileges and tax exemptions across the empire in exchange for naval support. This was not generosity. It was reliance. Byzantium did not reward Venice out of goodwill. It did so because its economy depended on Venetian logistics. With that decree, Venice stopped paying for survival and began charging for access. Trade privileges became political leverage. Access replaced tribute. Venice learned early that influence did not require domination, only indispensability. While other cities sought royal protection, Venice avoided crowns entirely. There was no king to overthrow, no dynasty to manipulate, no single ruler whose capture would collapse the state. Authority was distributed deliberately. Power flowed through laws, councils, and procedures rather than bloodlines. Venice did not rule by divine right, it ruled by design. That design produced a radical social outcome. In most of Europe, merchants ranked low in status. They were tolerated but distrusted. Making money was useful, but morally suspect. Power belonged to landowners and warriors. Venice never developed that hierarchy. There was no feudal nobility to dominate politics. The people who organized trade, financed voyages, and managed risk were not outsiders. They were the ruling class. From the beginning, Venice's elite were merchants. Their authority came from experience, competence, and reliability. Wealth was earned by surviving storms, honoring contracts, and delivering goods across hostile waters. Economic skill was not shameful. It was the foundation of legitimacy. As Venice matured, merchant power gradually hardened into political authority. This did not happen through revolution or violence, but through normalization. The same families who managed trade networks also governed the state. Decision-making increasingly reflected commercial logic, long-term planning, risk reduction, and institutional continuity. Glory mattered less than stability. Expansion mattered less than reliability. This system was formalized in 1297 through a political restructuring known as the Serrata, or closure, of the Great Council. Membership in Venice's ruling body was restricted to established families. This move is often portrayed as oligarchic, and in many ways it was. But Venice did not create an aristocracy of land or military conquest. It created an aristocracy of accounting, logistics, and capital management. Power became hereditary, but it was inherited competence that mattered most. The system was designed to prevent sudden takeovers, populist swings, and individual dominance. Leaders served short terms. Elections were complex and layered. Oversight was relentless. Severe penalties discouraged ambition that threatened stability. The goal was not democracy in the modern sense. It was predictability. Venice trusted neither kings nor crowds. It trusted processes. Once merchants controlled the state, governance itself began to change. Cities stopped behaving like a warlord extracting tribute and started acting like an institution managing risk. The government embedded itself into commerce rather than standing above it. Money was no longer just circulating, it was being organized. That shift became most visible in Venice's approach to public finance.
How?
Most medieval governments treated debt as a last resort. They borrowed when desperate, defaulted when convenient, and looted when necessary. Debt signaled failure. Venice reversed this logic. It borrowed deliberately. When the state required funds, it issued prestiti, mandatory loans imposed on wealthy citizens. On the surface, this appeared coercive. In reality, it was transformative. The state paid interest, claims were transferable, debt became an asset. For the first time, citizens were not merely subjects, they were creditors. This changed incentives fundamentally. Once you hold government debt, your interests align with state survival. Stability becomes personal. Predictable policy becomes valuable. Chaos becomes costly. Venice understood this dynamic clearly. Debt was not a burden. It was a binding mechanism that tied elite wealth to institutional continuity. The wealthiest citizens had the most to lose if the system collapsed. Loyalty was no longer enforced through fear or ideology. It was enforced through yield. Venice had created public debt centuries before modern states claimed the concept as innovation. More importantly, it honored that debt. Defaults were avoided. Trust was defended aggressively. Venice recognized that financial credibility was fragile. Once broken, it collapsed faster than armies ever could. That understanding shaped everything that followed. Debt alone, however, could not sustain Venice's ambitions. The city also needed a way to move money safely and efficiently across long distances without transporting physical gold through pirate-infested waters. Venice solved this problem by separating money from metal. In 1587, the state established the Banco di Rialto, a public bank designed not to speculate, but to stabilize. Deposits were not piles of coins locked in vaults. They were ledger entries, balances recorded, transferred, and settled through trusted institutions. To modernize, this seems ordinary. In its time, it was revolutionary. For centuries, money had been tangible, heavy, vulnerable. By turning currency into accounting, Venice made it faster, safer, and more reliable. Merchants could settle large obligations without moving a single coin. Fraud declined, disputes fell, trade accelerated. This was not innovation for its own sake. It was risk management. Venice understood something fundamental. Whoever controls the system used to settle obligations controls the economy itself, not through force, but through necessity. As a result, the state guarded its financial infrastructure obsessively. Speculation was restricted, rules were strict. Violations were punished severely. Financial misconduct was not cleverness. It was treated as treason. The product Venice offered was not excitement or rapid growth, it was reliability. The city chose slow expansion over reckless profit, predictable returns over explosive gains. In modern terms, it prioritized systemic stability over short-term performance. For centuries, this approach worked. But success carried consequences. Over time, stability hardened into rigidity. Venice became conservative, protective, and resistant to change. Innovation slowed. New trade routes bypassed the city. The very systems that once gave Venice an advantage became constraints. The structure survived, but the empire stagnated. Yet Venice's ideas did not disappear. They migrated. To Amsterdam, where public debt markets were refined. To London, where permanent state borrowing became normalized. To New York, where finance detached further from physical limits. Different cities, same logic. Today, nations dominate not because they own gold, but because markets believe their promises. Government bonds are backed by confidence. Central banks manage belief as much as interest rates. The financial system is a network of promises everyone agrees to treat as real. Venice understood how fragile that agreement was. That is why it enforced discipline, is why it kept finance boring. Modern systems often forget this lesson. Debt grows faster than accountability. Risk is privatized in good times and socialized in collapse. Venice would have recognized the danger immediately, because Venice understood something most powers eventually forget. Stability is never free. Over time, its discipline hardened into caution, and caution turned into resistance. The systems that once protected Venice began to slow it down. Its elites grew careful, then conservative, then defensive. Innovation faded. New routes redirected global trade. The machinery endured, but momentum vanished. Venice did not collapse overnight. It simply stopped adapting. That distinction matters. Financial systems do not only fail through disaster, sometimes they weaken through success. When preserving structure becomes more important than questioning it, flexibility disappears. Venice mastered money by respecting its boundaries. It declined when it treated those boundaries as permanent. That tension remains with us today. It's a deeper lesson Venice leaves behind is uncomfortable but essential. Money is never neutral. It reflects trust, power, and protection. It determines who benefits from stability and who absorbs the cost when confidence breaks. Systems built on trust can generate remarkable endurance, but only when discipline is enforced and accountability is real. Without that balance, trust becomes theater. Empires do not fall when they run out of currency. They fall when belief erodes, when promises feel hollow, when numbers lose meaning. Venice never ruled the world through armies. It shaped it by aligning incentives more intelligently than anyone else. It transformed trust into structure, obligation into loyalty, and finance into governance itself. Whether we recognize it or not, we still operate inside frameworks Venice helped design, understanding that history is not academic, it is practical. If this changed how you see money, power, or stability, consider subscribing. History doesn't repeat, but it does explain. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it.